Margaret Thornfield adjusted her reading glasses and squinted through the morning fog at the property next door. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Where yesterday there had been pristine Kentucky bluegrass, now rows of what appeared to be vegetables stretched across the entire front yard like some agricultural rebellion against civilized society. She grabbed her clipboard, the one she kept specifically for HOA violations, and marched across the street in her terry cloth slippers. The dew soaked through immediately, but Margaret barely noticed. 23 years as Willowbrook Gardens HOA president had taught her that swift action prevented chaos from taking root. "Excuse me," she called out to the figure bent over what looked suspiciously like tomato plants. "Are you aware that Section 4.2 of our community covenant clearly states that front yard landscaping must consist of approved grass varieties and ornamental plantings only?" David Chen straightened up, dirt under his fingernails and a confused smile spreading across his face. He was new to the neighborhood, having moved in just 6 weeks ago with his wife and twin daughters. "Good morning, I'm David. We met at the block party. Remember? And this isn't landscaping, it's food." Margaret's pen clicked against her clipboard with increasing intensity. "Food doesn't belong in front yards, Mr. Chen. This is a residential community with property values to maintain, not some rural farming district. I checked the county records before I planted," David said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "My property deed has no restrictions on agricultural use. In fact, the county agricultural extension office helped me plan the layout." The pen clicking stopped. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Your deed is irrelevant. The HOA covenant supersedes individual property rights within our community boundaries. Actually, I don't think that's how property law works," David said, his voice still friendly, but with an edge of firmness. "And I'm not planning to remove any of this. My family relies on growing our own food." Margaret surveyed the rows of green shoots with growing horror. Carrots, it looked like. And were those beans climbing up stakes? The very sight made her temples throb. In 23 years, no one had dared challenge the landscaping rules. Not the Hendersons with their rose garden proposal, not the Patels with their native plant request, and certainly not some newcomer with delusions of running a farm in suburbia. "Mr. Chen, I'm issuing you a formal notice of violation with a 10-day compliance deadline," she announced, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. "Remove all unauthorized plantings, or face escalating fines and potential legal action." David's expression shifted from confused to concerned. "Legal action? Over vegetables? Ma'am, with respect, I think you might be overreacting." "Overreacting?" Margaret's voice rose an octave. "Mr. Chen, do you see the house over there?" She pointed to the pristine colonial where the Mitchells lived. 43 years they've maintained perfect landscaping standards. And that one, she gestured toward the corner house. "The Johnsons have won our community beautification award 6 times. Do you think they want to look out their windows at a vegetable patch that belongs behind a barn?" Several neighbors had emerged from their houses now, drawn by Margaret's increasingly theatrical gestures. Mrs. Patterson from across the street held her morning coffee like it was theater popcorn. The teenage boy from 2 doors down had actually stopped his morning jog to watch. "I understand you care about the community," David said, clearly trying to de-escalate, "but these plants are beautiful in their own way. And they're providing healthy food for my family. Surely that's not something anyone would object to." Margaret felt her face flush red. The gathering audience made retreat impossible now. Her authority was being questioned in public, in front of people who had respected her judgment for over 2 decades. 10 days, Mr. Chen, she repeated, ripping the violation notice from her clipboard and thrusting it toward him. 10 days, or I'll be forced to take more serious action. As she turned to walk back to her house, she heard Mrs. Patterson call out, "Those tomatoes look wonderful, David. My grandmother used to grow ones just like that." Margaret's slippers squelched through the wet grass with each determined step. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of neighbors introducing themselves to David, asking about his plans. actually encouraging this blatant violation of everything that kept their community civilized. By the time she reached her front door, 3 more neighbors had wandered over to examine David's garden. Margaret watched from her window as they pointed at different plants, nodding and smiling like they were viewing art in a museum instead of witnessing the first crack in the foundation of everything she'd worked to build. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the contact for the county code enforcement office. If David Chen thought he could ignore the rules that everyone else followed, he was about to learn that Margaret Thornfield hadn't maintained order in Willowbrook Gardens for 23 years. By accepting no as an answer, the phone rang twice before a bored voice answered. Code enforcement, this is Margaret Thornfield, HOA president of Willowbrook Gardens. I need to report an illegal farming operation in a residential zone. As she spoke, Margaret watched David demonstrate something about soil depth to old Mr. Rodriguez, who was nodding enthusiastically and gesturing toward his own yard. The sight made her grip the phone tighter. This was just the beginning. Margaret sat in her home office at 5:47 a.m., surrounded by 3 decades of HOA documentation. Thick binders lined the walls, each labeled with years and violations successfully resolved. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. The humiliation of yesterday morning played on loop in her mind. The way the neighbors had gathered around David Chen like he was some kind of hero instead of a rule breaker who threatened everything they'd built together. She pulled up the Willowbrook Gardens property values on her laptop for the 15th time that week. Over the past 5 years, their community had outperformed surrounding neighborhoods by 12%. 12%. That wasn't luck or market forces. That was Margaret's relentless enforcement of standards that kept their streets looking like something from a magazine. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Sarah in Portland. Mom, saw your Facebook post about the neighbor's garden. Looks beautiful. Remember when we grew vegetables when I was little? You loved it back then. Margaret deleted the text without responding. Sarah didn't understand. Back then, they lived in a different neighborhood, one without standards or property values to protect. One where Margaret had been just another resident instead of someone people depended on to maintain order. She opened her laptop and began typing. Subject, formal HOA violation, agricultural use in residential zone. Urgent board action required. Fellow board members, as you are aware, we are facing an unprecedented challenge to our community's standards. Mr. Chen's continued refusal to comply with our landscaping covenant represents not just a single violation, but a direct threat to the property values and community character we have spent decades building. I have researched the legal precedents, and I believe we have grounds for immediate injunctive relief through the county court system. The Agricultural Extension Office may have provided guidance to Mr. Chen, but they do not supersede our HOA covenant, which every resident signed upon purchase. I am calling an emergency board meeting for tonight at 7 p.m. to discuss escalated enforcement measures, including daily fines starting at $50. Doubling each day of non-compliance legal action to force immediate removal of all non-compliant plantings liens against the property if necessary to end so. Rate compliance. This is not about vegetables. This is about whether we still believe in the standards that have made Willowbrook Gardens the most desirable community in the county. She hit send and immediately felt better. The board members, Tom, Linda, and Frank, had always supported her decisions. They understood what was at stake. By noon, Margaret had printed out 47 pages of legal precedents, HOA enforcement guidelines, and property value studies. She'd also driven past David's house 3 times, documenting the ongoing violation. With her phone camera, each photo showed neighbors stopping to admire the plants, including Mrs. Patterson, who was actually kneeling in the dirt examining something with a magnifying glass. The sight made Margaret's chest tight. These people didn't understand. They saw pretty plants and fresh vegetables, but they couldn't see the future. Property values declining, standards eroding, their pristine community becoming just another ordinary neighborhood where anything goes. Her doorbell rang at 2:15 p.m. Through the peephole, she saw David Chen holding what appeared to be a plate covered with a kitchen towel. Margaret opened the door, but left the chain engaged. "Mr. Chen, I believe I made our position clear yesterday. I brought you some lettuce from the garden," David said, holding up the plate. "It's probably the last harvest before the first frost. I thought maybe we could talk about this reasonably. There's nothing to discuss. You have 7 days remaining to achieve compliance." David shifted the plate to one hand and rubbed his forehead. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've been looking into this, and I really don't think the HOA covenant can override county zoning laws that explicitly allow agricultural use. My property is zoned residential agricultural hybrid." "That's not something I added. That's how it was zoned when your HOA was established." Margaret felt something cold creep up her spine. "That's impossible. I personally reviewed all zoning classifications when we incorporated. I have the original county records if you'd like to see them," David said gently. "Look, I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm just trying to feed my family and maybe share some fresh vegetables with neighbors who want them. Half the people on the street have asked me for gardening advice." Through the gap in the door, Margaret could see Mrs. Patterson's house, where someone had apparently started digging up a section of their front lawn. The sight made her feel dizzy. "The records you're referring to are outdated," she managed. "Property rights within an HOA are governed by the covenant, not original zoning classifications." David nodded slowly. "I understand that's what you believe, but I've consulted with a property lawyer, and he disagrees. I really hope we can work this out without involving lawyers. But if you continue to threaten legal action against me for growing food on my property, I may not have a choice." Margaret closed the door and engaged all 3 locks. Through the window, she watched David walk back to his house, stopping to wave at Mr. Rodriguez, who was apparently taking measurements of his own front yard with a tape measure. She called Tom Brennan, the board treasurer. Immediately, "Tom, we have a problem. Chen is threatening legal action, and he's convinced half the neighborhood to start digging up their lawns." "Margaret, I've been meaning to talk to you about this," Tom said, and she could hear something different in his voice. "Linda and I drove by his house this morning. It actually looks really nice. Professional, even, and my wife's been wanting to start a herb garden for years." Margaret sat down hard in her kitchen chair. "Tom, you can't be serious. Look, Margaret, you've done great work keeping our property values up, but maybe this isn't the hill to die on. The guy's growing food, not parking broken cars in his yard." After she hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the plate David had left on her doorstep. Through the window, she could see more neighbors gathered around his garden, including two she'd never seen show interest in landscaping before. For the first time in 23 years, Margaret Thornfield felt like she was losing control, and if she was losing control, then everything she'd built, everything she'd protected, was at risk. She picked up her phone and scrolled to the contact for the law firm that handled her legal matters. If David Chen wanted to involve lawyers, she'd give him lawyers. The Willowbrook Gardens Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this large since the Great Mailbox controversy of 2018. Folding chairs had been ranged in neat rows, but at least 30 residents stood along the walls, and more kept arriving. Margaret sat at the head table with the other board members. A thick folder of legal documents ranged precisely in front of her. She'd called this emergency community meeting to address what she termed the agricultural crisis, threatening our property values and community standards. The lawyer she'd consulted, a sharp-suited man named Bradley Pierce who specialized in horror enforcement, sat beside her reviewing his notes. David Chen sat in the third row with his wife Jenny and their twin daughters. Looking uncomfortable but determined, Margaret noticed he had his own folder, considerably thicker than hers. "Thank you all for attending," Margaret began. her voice carrying the authority of 23 years of unopposed leadership. "We're here tonight because the actions of one resident threatened to undermine the very foundations of what makes Willowbrook Gardens special." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Not all of them supportive. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. "Margaret, before you continue, I think we should hear from David. He's prepared a presentation." "This is not a debate, Mrs. Patterson. This is an informational meeting about HOA enforcement procedures." Margaret gestured to her lawyer. "Mr. Pierce will explain the legal framework that governs our community's standards." Bradley Pierce stood, adjusting his tie. "Ladies and gentlemen, homeowners associations exist to protect property values through consistent enforcement of community standards. When one resident violates the covenant, it creates precedent for further violations, ultimately degrading the community's value and character. What about property rights?" Called out Tom Rodriguez from the back. "David owns his land fair and square. Property rights within an HOA are defined by the covenant every resident signed," Pierce replied smoothly. "Mr. Chen's agricultural activities constitute a clear violation of Section 4.2, which requires front yard landscaping to consist exclusively of approved grass varieties and ornamental plantings." David stood up, his folder in hand. "May I respond to that?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "Mr. Chen, this isn't a trial. It's an informational meeting." "Then let me provide some information," David said, opening his folder. "First, I'd like everyone to see the original county zoning map from 1987. When this HOA was incorporated," he held up a large document that even from the front of the room, Margaret could see was official county letterhead. "Every property in Willowbrook Gardens is zoned RA1, residential agricultural. That zoning explicitly permits agricultural activities including vegetable gardens, small-scale farming, and food production." A wave of interested murmurs swept the room. Pierce leaned over to whisper something in Margaret's ear, but she was staring at the document David held. "Furthermore," David continued, "I have correspondence from the county planning office stating that HOA covenants cannot override county zoning laws. Any covenant provision that conflicts with zoning is legally unenforceable." Margaret felt heat creeping up her neck. "Mr. Chen, county zoning is irrelevant when residents have contractually agreed to HOA standards that supersede those basic requirements." David smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That would be true, except for one problem." He pulled out another document. "This is the original covenant document from 1987. Section 4.2, which you've been citing, was added in 1994 through a board amendment. But according to the HOA's own bylaws, amendments that conflict with property zoning rights require approval by 2/3 of all homeowners, not just board members." The room fell silent. Margaret's hands gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles went white. "I have the voting records from 1994, David continued. "The amendment was approved by a vote of HOA board members. No community vote was ever held, which means, according to your own legal framework, Section 4.2 has been unenforceable for 30 years. Pierce was frantically scribbling notes and whispering urgently to Margaret, but she wasn't listening. She was remembering 1994, her second year as HOA president, when old Mrs. Henderson had wanted to plant a vegetable garden and Margaret had pushed through the landscaping amendment to stop her. It had seemed so reasonable at the time, a simple clarification of community standards. Additionally, David said, now addressing the room rather than the board table, "I've documented 12 other violations of community standards that have been selectively ignored. Over the past 5 years, board members' properties that don't comply with the very rules being enforced against others." He began reading from a list: unauthorized decorative fencing, non-approved mailbox designs, landscape lighting installed without architectural review, paint colors outside the approved palette. With each item, he named an address, and Margaret realized with growing horror that he was naming the homes of board members and their friends. The community center erupted in conversation. Residents turned to each other, pointing toward the board table. Voices rising with questions and accusations. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting is adjourned, actually," called out Mrs. Patterson, now standing as well. According to the HOA bylaws, community meetings can only be adjourned by majority vote of attending residents. "I second the motion to continue," shouted Tom Rodriguez. "All in favor of continuing the meeting," Mrs. Patterson called out. A forest of hands shot up across the room. Margaret counted quickly. At least 2/3 of the attendees. David had returned to his seat, but the folder remained open on his lap. "I have one more thing," he said quietly, and somehow his voice carried across the still noisy room. "Mrs. Thornfield, you've lived in this community longer than almost anyone. You've put enormous effort into maintaining standards and property values, but those vegetables you're so concerned about, they're increasing our property values, not decreasing them." He pulled out a final document. "This is a comparative market analysis from 3 real estate agencies. Properties near community gardens and sustainable food production consistently appraise 8 to 15% higher than similar properties without those features. The vegetables aren't destroying our community. They're making it more valuable." Margaret looked around the room at faces she'd known for decades, people who had trusted her judgment, supported her decisions, elected her to leadership year after year. Now they were looking at her with confusion, disappointment, and something that might have been pity. For the first time in 23 years, Margaret Thornfield felt truly alone. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching David Chen harvest the last of his fall vegetables. The morning frost had touched the edges of his tomato leaves, but the plants still produced enough for him to fill a basket with red and green fruit. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson's herb garden had exploded into a riot of late-season sage and rosemary. 2 houses down, the Johansons had installed raised beds where their perfectly manicured lawn used to be. Even Tom Brennan, her former board ally, had planted what appeared to be a winter squash patch in his side yard. The emergency board meeting that followed David's community presentation had lasted until nearly midnight. By the end, Margaret had resigned as HOA president and been replaced by Mrs. Patterson, who immediately announced a community-wide review of all HOA rules and enforcement practices. The legal bills from her consultation with Bradley Pierce sat unopened on her kitchen counter. David had never filed any lawsuits, never demanded financial compensation for her threats and harassment. He'd simply continued growing vegetables and sharing them with neighbors who increasingly treated him like some kind of local hero. Margaret's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Jenny Chen, David's wife, holding a cloth bag that appeared to be full of produce. "Mrs. Thornfield." Jenny's voice was soft when Margaret opened the door. "I hope I'm not bothering you. David mentioned you might like some of our winter vegetables before the hard frost kills everything." Margaret looked at the bag, then at Jenny's kind face. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Chen, but I don't think it's appropriate." Jenny smiled. "David told me you used to grow vegetables when your daughter was little. He said you probably knew more about gardening than anyone in the neighborhood." "David said that he's been hoping you'd come over and give him some advice. Actually, he's planning next year's garden, and he's worried about proper crop rotation." Jenny held out the bag. "These are winter squash and late carrots, perfect for roasting." Margaret accepted the bag, feeling its weight in her hands. "Why would he want my advice after everything I've done?" Jenny shrugged. "He says you care about this community more than anyone he's ever met. He thinks maybe you were just protecting something important in the wrong way." After Jenny left, Margaret sat at her kitchen table examining the vegetables. The carrots were perfectly shaped, deep orange with bright green tops still attached. The winter squash had the kind of thick skin that meant months of storage, the kind she remembered from her grandmother's root cellar. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Sarah. Saw on Facebook that the neighborhood HOA Drama resolved. Maybe now you can start that garden you always talked about going back to. Love you, Mom. Margaret put the phone down and walked to her front window. David was showing something to Mr. Rodriguez, both men kneeling by the bean plants. As she watched, David looked up toward her house and waved, after a moment's hesitation. Margaret waved back. That evening, she walked outside for the first time in 3 weeks without her horror violation clipboard. David was covering his tomato plants with sheets to protect them from the forecasted frost. David, she called out, crossing the street. Jenny mentioned you were planning next year's garden. He looked up, surprise and wariness competing on his face. Yes, ma'am, I'm still learning as I go. Margaret surveyed his neat rows, the careful spacing, the obvious attention to plant health and soil quality. You've done good work here. But if you're planning to expand, you'll want to consider companion planting. Tomatoes and basil together, carrots with chives. David's face lit up. Would you be willing to show me? I mean, if you have time. Margaret looked around at the neighborhood she'd protected for 23 years, now dotted with the green evidence of her failure to maintain control. But somehow, in the failing light of early winter, it looked more alive than it had in decades. I have time, she said as they talked about soil pH and composting strategies. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge instead of enforcing rules. But even as she explained the benefits of cover crops and crop rotation, a small part of her mind was already wondering what would happen when word spread that the former HOA president was now collaborating with the neighborhood's biggest rule breaker. By spring, everyone would have gardens, property values might indeed rise. Just as David had predicted, the community might become more connected, more sustainable, more self-sufficient. But it would also be completely beyond Margaret's control. And as she watched David carefully note her suggestions in a well-worn garden journal, she realized she still wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that.